August 9th, 378 AD, Roman Emperor Valens led 15,000 legionaries into a valley 9 miles north of Adrianople, convinced he was about to crush a cornered barbarian horde. By sunset, 2/3 of his army lay dead. The emperor's body was never found, and the invincible Roman military machine that had dominated the world for 6 centuries shattered in a single afternoon. Think about those numbers for a second. 15,000 professional soldiers, the finest infantry the empire could field, annihilated in 6 hours. This wasn't just a defeat. This was the day Rome learned it could die. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how everything Rome believed about warfare became a death sentence. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see the fall of Rome forever. First, the catastrophic mistake Valens made at 2 p.m. that doomed his entire army. Second, why 20,000 Gothic cavalry appeared out of nowhere at the exact moment the Romans couldn't defend themselves. And third, the haunting way Valens died, burned alive in a peasant's hut while his empire burned with him. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did Rome's professional legions, undefeated for generations, collapse in minutes against warriors they called barbarians? Why did Valens ignore every warning, every plea to wait, every voice of reason? What tactical evolution did the Goths deploy that rendered Roman shield walls obsolete? To understand how one afternoon destroyed an empire, we need to go back to the moment everything started falling apart. For 300 years, Rome had been invincible. Not metaphorically invincible, actually invincible. The legions marched from Britain to Persia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, and when they met resistance, they crushed it with industrial efficiency. Barbarian tribes learned a simple truth. You don't fight Rome. You negotiate, you submit, you pay tribute, or you die. But in the summer of 378, standing in his palace in Constantinople, Emperor Valens was about to learn that invincibility is just a story empires tell themselves until reality proves otherwise. Think about Rome's military record for a moment. Since the reforms of Diocletian in 284 AD, the legions had fought over 200 major engagements against barbarian peoples. They'd lost exactly 3. 3 defeats in nearly a century of constant warfare. The ratio was staggering, roughly 67 victories for every loss. When Rome committed professional troops to a battlefield, the outcome wasn't in question, only the body count. The Roman military machine operated on principles that made defeat nearly impossible. Every legion followed identical training regimens, used standardized equipment, deployed in the same proven formations. A soldier from Britain could integrate seamlessly into a unit fighting in Syria because every man knew the same drills, spoke the same commands, fought the same way. This wasn't an army. This was an industrial system for converting untrained barbarians into corpses. The standard Roman infantry unit, the cohort of 500 men, could march 20 miles in 5 hours carrying 60 pounds of equipment, then deploy for battle immediately. They trained 300 days a year in weapons drill, formation fighting, and entrenchment. By the time a legionary faced combat, he'd thrust his gladius 10,000 times in practice, locked shields with his unit brothers in 1,000 mock battles. Barbarian warriors, trained informally in tribal settings, fought with individual courage and tribal honor. Roman soldiers fought with mathematical precision. Here's what made Rome truly terrifying. They learned from every engagement. After the Gothic wars of the 260s, Roman military manuals were updated to include specific tactics for fighting Germanic shield walls. When Sassanid Persia developed heavy cavalry in the 320s. Rome created specialized anti-cavalry units within a decade. The empire absorbed every tactical innovation, every new weapon, every fighting style it encountered, and integrated the best elements into its own doctrine. Fighting Rome meant facing an enemy that had already studied how to kill people exactly like you. But invincibility creates blindness. By 378, Roman commanders had stopped innovating and started following doctrine written 50 years earlier. The legions still trained to fight infantry battles against shield wall formations, still deployed in the checkerboard pattern designed for conquering Gaul, still assumed that disciplined heavy infantry would dominate any battlefield against lighter equipped barbarians. No one had seriously considered what would happen if those barbarians stopped fighting on Rome's terms. What happens when an empire that hasn't lost a major battle in 3 generations faces an enemy that evolved specifically to destroy everything Rome's doctrine assumed? Emperor Valens was about to find out, and the answer would arrive in the form of desperate people Rome had pushed too far, people who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. But first, those people had to cross the Danube. 2 years earlier, in 376, something unprecedented happened along Rome's northern frontier. Hundreds of thousands of Gothic refugees appeared on the north bank of the Danube, begging for asylum. Not raiding, not invading, begging. They were fleeing the Huns, a nightmare people from the eastern steppes who destroyed everything in their path. The Goths offered Rome a deal. Let us cross into imperial territory, settle on empty lands, and we'll serve in your legions. It was the kind of arrangement Rome had made dozens of times with barbarian peoples. But this time, Roman greed and incompetence would turn grateful refugees into the most dangerous enemy the empire had ever faced. The Goths weren't cowards. These were the same warriors who'd fought Rome to a standstill in the Gothic wars of the 260s, who'd carved out kingdoms across the Black Sea region, who'd terrorized the Balkans for generations. When Gothic emissaries told Roman officials they were fleeing in terror, Rome should have paid attention. What could scare the Goths? The Huns, mounted archers from the Asian steppes who'd exploded into Gothic territory in 375 with a speed and brutality that defied comprehension. They fought from horseback with composite bows that could punch through armor at 200 yards. They moved faster than any army the Goths had encountered, appearing without warning, destroying settlements, vanishing before defensive forces could organize. Gothic kings who'd ruled for decades were dead within months. Entire tribal confederations, tens of thousands of warriors and their families, were scattered or enslaved. The Goths had 2 choices: cross the Danube into Roman territory or wait, to be destroyed. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about the scale. Roman sources recorded the Gothic migration as countless multitudes and numbers beyond reckoning. Modern historians, working from logistical evidence and later population records, estimate between 80,000 and 200,000 people appeared on the Danube's north bank in the spring and summer of 376. Let that sink in. That's not an army. That's an entire nation on the move. Women, children, elderly, livestock, wagons loaded with everything these people owned. They weren't preparing for a raid. They were bringing their entire civilization to Rome's doorstep. The Gothic leadership approached this carefully. Fritigern, chieftain of the Thervingi Goths, and Alavivus, leader of a smaller faction, sent formal embassies to Valens' court in Constantinople. Their offer was straightforward and precedented. Grant us land in Thrace, Roman territory but sparsely populated after decades of raiding and plague. We'll settle as farmers. We'll pay taxes. Our warriors will serve in your legions as auxiliary troops. Rome keeps the Danube frontier secure. We get safety from the Huns. Everyone wins. Rome had done this successfully before. The Franks were settled in Gaul in 341. The Alemanni were integrated into frontier provinces. Barbarian auxiliary units formed some of Rome's best troops. Fierce fighters with tribal loyalty redirected toward imperial service. The system worked when Rome managed it properly. Screening refugees, controlling crossings, distributing settlements carefully, integrating populations over time. But here's where it gets insane. Valens saw those numbers, 80,000 minimum, possibly twice that, and saw something different. Not refugees, not future taxpayers and soldiers. He saw the largest slave labor force and military recruitment pool that had appeared on Rome's doorstep in a century, and the officials he sent to manage them, crossing saw profit. What happened next would transform desperate allies into Rome's executioners. The Gothic refugees who crossed the Danube legally, with Rome's permission, numbered somewhere between 80,000 and 200,000 people. Men, women, children, entire tribes with their herds and possessions crossing on Roman boats, submitting to Roman authority. They were supposed to be fed, settled, integrated. Instead, the Roman governors saw profit. Lupicinus and Maximus, the two officials responsible for managing the Gothic settlement, began selling the refugees food at extortionate prices. When the Goths ran out of money, these officials offered a new deal. Sell your children into slavery for dog meat. Not a metaphor. Actual dog meat. The chroniclers specified what kind. Ammianus Marcellinus, the most reliable historian of the era, recorded the exchange rate with disgusting precision. 1 healthy Gothic child for 1 dead dog. The Romans didn't even slaughter the dogs, fresh. These were diseased animals, scavenged carcasses, meat that Roman soldiers wouldn't feed to their own dogs. Gothic parents, warriors who'd crossed the Danube to become Rome's allies, stood in line with their children, waiting to trade a son or daughter for rotting flesh that might keep their remaining family alive another week. Think about the scale for a moment. Even conservative estimates put the Gothic population at 80,000. At least half were non-combatants, women, children, elderly. That's 40,000 vulnerable people who needed food immediately. The Romans had promised provisions during the settlement process. Instead, Lupicinus and Maximus seized the imperial grain shipments designated for the refugees and sold them back at 10 times the normal price. When the Goths' silver ran out, and it ran out fast, the slave trade began. Here's what makes this genuinely evil. It was systematic. Roman officials set up trading posts along the settlement zone. Gothic, families could exchange children for food at fixed rates. 1 child equals 1 dog carcass or 2 loaves of bread. Some Roman merchants offered better deals. 1 child for a week's worth of grain. The chroniclers don't record how many Gothic children were sold. But fragmentary records from slave markets in Constantinople and Antioch show a massive influx of Gothic slaves in 376 and 377. Thousands minimum, possibly tens of thousands. The Gothic warriors watched this happen and couldn't stop it. They'd surrendered their weapons at the Danube crossing, standard Roman protocol for refugee populations. They were supposed to be rearmed as auxiliary troops after processing. That rearming never happened. Lupicinus and Maximus kept the Goths disarmed, desperate, and starving, because that's when you get the best prices for children. But here's where Roman arrogance became fatal. Lupicinus and Maximus assumed the Goths would stay broken, that hunger and desperation would keep them compliant. They forgot that starving men with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous people on earth. And they definitely forgot that some of those Goths, the warriors, the tribal champions, The men who'd fought Rome to a standstill in previous wars still remembered how to kill. By late 377, Gothic patience was running out. Families were being destroyed, children were disappearing into Roman slave markets, and the warriors who'd crossed the Danube peacefully were starting to remember that they were, in fact, warriors. All they needed was a spark. Lupicinus was about to provide it. By 377, the Gothic settlement had become a powder keg. Thousands were starving. Children had been sold into slavery. Gothic warriors, men who'd crossed the Danube peacefully, watched their families suffer while Roman officials got rich. The Gothic leader, Fritigern, a pragmatic chieftain who genuinely wanted peace with Rome, requested a meeting with Lupicinus in the city of Marcianopolis to negotiate better terms. What happened next turned loyal federates into Rome's worst nightmare. Lupicinus invited Fritigern and his bodyguards to a feast in the governor's palace. While they ate, Roman soldiers surrounded the building and massacred the Gothic warriors waiting outside. The meeting was scheduled for mid-morning in early spring of 377. Fritigern arrived with 200 warriors, his personal retinue and tribal champions. Standard diplomatic practice. You don't meet a Roman governor alone, and you bring enough men to demonstrate your importance without threatening. The Goths left their main warband outside Marcianopolis, several miles away, as a gesture of good faith. They entered the city unarmed at Lupicinus's request, another gesture of trust. Lupicinus received Fritigern with elaborate ceremony. Tables laden with Roman delicacies, roasted pork, fresh bread, wine from Gaul. The kind of feast the Goths hadn't seen in months. Fritigern and his inner circle, maybe 20 senior warriors, were escorted into the governor's triclinium, the formal dining room. The remaining 180 Gothic warriors waited in the palace courtyard, as protocol demanded. Here's what the Gothic delegation didn't see. While servants poured wine and presented food, Lupicinus had positioned 3 centuries of Roman infantry around the palace. Roughly 240 soldiers in full armor with drawn swords, not ceremonial guards, combat troops from the local garrison. They moved into position silently, while Fritigern and Lupicinus discussed grain shipments and settlement boundaries. The signal came at midday. Sources differ on whether Lupicinus gave a verbal command or simply nodded to his officers. What's certain is that Roman soldiers surged into the palace courtyard from 3 sides simultaneously. The Gothic warriors, unarmed and unprepared, were butchered where they stood. The Romans used gladi, short stabbing swords designed for close-quarter slaughter. In an enclosed courtyard against unarmored, weaponless men, it was systematic murder. The screams reached the dining room. Fritigern understood immediately. He was at a feast while his men were being killed. Lupicinus smiled and gestured for more wine, as if the sounds of slaughter were entertainment. Here's where Fritigern proved why he'd survived decades of tribal warfare. Instead of panicking, he stood calmly and told Lupicinus the truth. You've just started a war you cannot win. Then he did something that shouldn't have been possible. Fritigern and his inner circle fought their way out of the palace. 20 Gothic warriors, unarmed, against Roman guards in full kit. They grabbed furniture as weapons, chairs, candlesticks, anything. They killed 6 Roman soldiers with their bare hands, according to later accounts. They smashed through a side exit and ran through Marcianopolis' streets toward the gates. Lupicinus sent cavalry after them. Fritigern escaped with 11 men. 9 of his bodyguards died buying time. When Fritigern reached the Gothic camps outside the city and told his warriors what happened, the response was instantaneous. The Goths stopped being refugees and became an army. Fritigern escaped Marcianopolis with a handful of men, and when word spread of the massacre, every Gothic warrior in Thrace took up arms. What started as a refugee crisis became a full-scale rebellion. The Goths had nothing to lose now. Their families were hostages or slaves. Their leaders had been betrayed under a flag of truce. The promise of Roman civilization had revealed itself as a lie wrapped around systematic exploitation. They burned estates, freed slaves, armed themselves from captured Roman armories, and learned something that shocked them. They could beat Roman armies in open battle. By the spring of 378, Gothic war bands had defeated 3 separate Roman forces and were ranging freely across Thrace, the empire's richest province. The transformation happened within days. Gothic warriors who'd been disarmed at the Danube crossing raided Roman military supply depots across Thrace. Every garrison town, every frontier fort, every army staging area maintained armories for local troops. The Goths hit them systematically. At Beroea, they overwhelmed the garrison and seized 4,000 swords, 2,000 spears, and 600 suits of mail armor. At Philippopolis, they captured an entire artillery park, ballistae, onagers, siege equipment the Romans never imagined barbarians could use. But here's what made the Gothic revolt genuinely dangerous. They weren't just raiding randomly. Fritigern was coordinating a systematic military campaign. He divided his forces into mobile war bands of 500 to 2,000 warriors each. These bands moved fast, struck hard, and vanished before Roman reinforcements could arrive. They burned estates belonging to senators who'd profited from the slave trade. They freed every Gothic slave they found, instantly swelling their numbers. They recruited Roman deserters, soldiers disgusted by Lupicinus's corruption, who switched sides. The first Roman military response came in late spring of 377. Lupicinus himself led a force of approximately 3,000 regular infantry and 500 cavalry to crush what he still believed was a minor uprising. The armies met near a town called Salices. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, Lupicinus was in full retreat and 800 Roman soldiers were dead. The Goths lost fewer than 200. Let that sink in. Refugee warriors who'd been starving and unarmed 3 months earlier had just mauled a professional Roman army. The second defeat came in summer. A larger Roman force under the general Trajan, not the famous emperor, a different Trajan, engaged Gothic forces near Nicopolis. 4,000 Romans against roughly 6,000 Goths. The Romans deployed in traditional formation, shield walls, and cavalry wings. The Goths refused to fight Rome's way. They used hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, night attacks. They avoided pitched battles and bled the Romans through constant harassment. After 2 weeks of this, Trajan withdrew. He'd lost over 1,000 men without forcing a decisive engagement. The third defeat was the most shocking. In early 378, Roman forces caught a Gothic warband in what appeared to be a perfect tactical situation, trapped against a river with Roman cavalry blocking escape routes. The Goths, facing certain destruction, charged directly into the Roman cavalry. They pulled riders from horses, killed them with captured Roman weapons, and seized the mounts. Within an hour, Gothic warriors who'd never fought as cavalry were riding Roman horses and hunting down fleeing legionaries. By spring 378, Thrace was burning. Gothic warbands controlled the countryside. Roman authority existed only inside walled cities. Trade routes were cut. Tax collection had stopped. And every week brought more reports of Roman defeats, more estates destroyed, more slaves freed and armed. Emperor Valens, watching his richest province collapse into chaos, made his decision. He would lead the army personally and crush this rebellion with such overwhelming force that no barbarian would dare challenge Rome for a generation. That decision would kill him and 15,000 of his best soldiers. Valens was in an impossible position. He was the Eastern Roman emperor, ruling from Constantinople, while his nephew Gratian ruled the west from Milan. The two men despised each other with a special hatred that only family can generate. Every Gothic victory made Valens look weaker, more incompetent. Worse, Gratian had just won a major victory against the Alemanni tribe in Gaul, and the Western court was celebrating him as a military genius. Valens, older, more experienced, couldn't stomach being upstaged by a boy barely out of his teens. He needed a victory. Not just any victory, a crushing, undeniable, glory-soaked triumph that would silence his critics and put his nephew in his place. The numbers tell the story. Valens was 50 years old, ruling for 14 years. Gratian was 19, emperor for only 4 years. In the rigid hierarchy of Roman imperial politics, the senior emperor was supposed to be the dominant partner. But Gratian's victory at Argentovaria in February 378 had shifted the balance. The young emperor led 35,000 troops against 40,000 Alemanni warriors and crushed them in a single afternoon. Roman casualties, fewer than 300. Alemanni dead, over 8,000. It was the kind of lopsided victory that made emperors legends. The Western court's propaganda machine went into overdrive. Poets composed verses comparing Gratian to Alexander. Senators praised his tactical genius. Coins were minted showing the young emperor trampling barbarian kings. And every piece of praise for Gratian was an implicit criticism of Valens, who'd let a refugee crisis spiral into full-scale rebellion in the empire's richest province. Here's what made the situation genuinely humiliating. Gratian offered to help. In July 378, messages arrived from the Western court. Gratian was marching east with reinforcements, experienced legions fresh from the Alemanni campaign, probably 10 to 15,000 men. He'd be in Thrace by mid-August. The offer was militarily sound. Combined, the two emperors could field over 30,000 professional troops against Gothic forces, estimated at 10 to 15,000 warriors. The rebellion would be crushed with overwhelming force. But accepting that help meant sharing the glory. It meant Gratian's troops fighting alongside Valens's legions, Gratian's generals offering advice, Gratian present at the final victory. The Senate would credit both emperors equally. Or worse, they'd credit the young military genius over the aging bureaucrat who'd needed rescue. Valens' advisors were divided. His senior general, Sebastianus, argued for waiting. The Gothic forces were scattered, living off plunder in Thrace. Time favored Rome. Let Gratian arrive, combine forces, execute a coordinated campaign that couldn't fail. Victor, the Magister Militum, agreed. Basic military logic. Don't fight with partial forces when reinforcements are days away. But other voices pushed for immediate action. Court officials who saw careers advancing if Valens won sole credit for crushing the rebellion. Younger generals who wanted glory before Gratian could steal it. And Valens himself, burning with the need to prove he was still Rome's premier military commander. The intelligence reports gave him justification. Scout estimates put Gothic forces at around 10,000 warriors concentrated near Adrianople. Valens could field 15,000 professional soldiers. That was a comfortable numerical advantage. 3 Romans for every 2 Goths. Historical precedent said Rome won those fights every time. On August 8, 378, Valens made his decision. He would march immediately, engage the Goths before Gratian arrived, and win the victory alone. What the intelligence reports didn't mention What the scouts either missed or failed to report was the Gothic cavalry. 20,000 mounted warriors under Alathius and Saphrax, currently away foraging. They'd returned to the battlefield at exactly the worst possible moment. But Valens didn't know that. All he knew was that glory waited 9 miles north of Adrianople, and he was going to seize it. August 8th, 378. Valens' army departed Adrianople at dawn, marching north toward the Gothic position near a place called Nice. Intelligence reports put the Gothic force at around 10,000 warriors, manageable for Rome's 15,000 professional soldiers. What those reports didn't mention was the Gothic cavalry. 20,000 horsemen under Alathius and Saphrax, elite riders who'd been away foraging for supplies. The scouts either didn't see them or didn't report them. Valens marched his army through the summer heat, over broken ground, without adequate water supplies, convinced he was about to crush a cornered enemy. The temperature that day reached somewhere between 90 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. The army's pace slowed to a crawl. The Roman force that left Adrianople represented the core of the Eastern Empire's military power. 15,000 men organized into traditional legion formations. Heavy infantry in segmented plate armor, lorica segmentata, carrying rectangular shields, gladi, and pila. Auxiliary units from across the empire, Syrian archers, Gallic cavalry, Iberian light infantry. The lancers and Madiari, elite Palatine units that served as the Emperor's household troops. On paper, it was a force capable of crushing any barbarian army in the Balkans. But armies don't fight on paper. They fight after marching 9 miles in killing heat. The march began at dawn, around 6 a.m., when temperatures were still manageable. But Thrace in August is brutal. By 8 a.m., the sun was hammering down. By 10 a.m., soldiers in full armor were staggering. Roman legionaries carried approximately 60 pounds of equipment: armor, weapons, shield, personal kit, rations. In moderate temperatures, a trained soldier could march 20 miles carrying that load. In 100-degree heat, every mile became torture. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about heat casualties. Soldiers don't just get tired, they start dying. Heat exhaustion progresses to heat stroke when your core body temperature exceeds 104 degrees Fahrenheit. You stop sweating. You become confused, disoriented. Your organs begin shutting down. Roman legionaries, encased in metal armor that absorbed and radiated heat, were walking ovens. Men dropped unconscious. Some never woke up. The terrain made it worse. The route from Adrianople to the Gothic position crossed broken, hilly ground. No shade, no water sources along the march. The baggage train, which carried water barrels and supply wagons, lagged miles behind the main force. Standard Roman practice was to ensure water availability for troops, especially in summer campaigns. Valens ignored it. Speed mattered more than supply. He wanted to reach the Goths before they could escape, before Gratian could arrive, before anyone could steal his victory. By noon, the army's cohesion was fragmenting. Units that should have maintained tight formation were strung out along the road. The vanguard was miles ahead of the rear guard. Soldiers abandoned equipment to lighten their loads. First the rations, then extra weapons, then anything that wasn't essential. Officers screamed orders to maintain formation. Men ignored them, focused only on putting one foot in front of the other. Think about what this meant tactically. Rome's greatest advantage was discipline, the ability to deploy in coordinated formations, to execute complex maneuvers, to maintain unit cohesion under pressure. That advantage requires fresh, alert, properly supplied troops. What arrived at the Gothic position around 2 p.m. was a mob of heat-exhausted, dehydrated, disorganized men who just marched 9 miles without water in 100-degree heat. They were about to fight the most important battle of their lives, and 20,000 Gothic cavalry were riding hard toward the battlefield, timing their arrival for maximum devastation. By early afternoon, Valens' army reached the Gothic position and found something they hadn't expected. Fritigern had formed his entire camp into a massive circle of wagons, a defensive laager that stretched across the valley floor. Behind those wagons stood the Gothic infantry, perhaps 10,000 warriors, families, and non-combatants. It was a defensive formation, the kind you build when you're preparing to be besieged. To Valens and his generals, it looked like the Goths were trapped and terrified. The Emperor ordered his army to deploy for assault. What he didn't know was that Fritigern was stalling, desperately buying time for his cavalry to return. The wagon circle was massive. Sources estimate between 3,000 and 5,000 wagons, arranged in an oval formation roughly a mile in circumference. Think about the logistics of that for a second. Each wagon was positioned axle to axle with its neighbors, creating a continuous wooden barrier 8 to 10 feet high. Gaps between wagons were filled with shields, sharpened stakes, and overturned carts. Behind this barrier, Gothic warriors had piled additional defenses, earth embankments, ditches, obstacles designed to break Roman formations. From the Roman perspective, this looked like victory. The home, Goths had abandoned mobile warfare and locked themselves into a static defensive position. Roman doctrine had answers for this. You encircled the enemy, brought up artillery, methodically reduced the defenses, then assaulted through prepared breaches. It was siege warfare on flat ground. Rome had perfected this over centuries. Valens deployed his army in traditional assault formation. Heavy infantry formed the center, dense blocks of legionaries preparing to advance in testudo. The turtle formation with overlocked shields. Cavalry took the wings, ready to sweep around the wagon circle and attack from multiple angles. Archers positioned behind the infantry to provide covering fire. The deployment took over an hour. Exhausted soldiers who just marched 9 miles without water now stood in formation under the afternoon sun, while officers organized the attack. Here's where Fritigern proved his tactical genius. Instead of waiting passively for the Roman assault, he sent envoys. Gothic emissaries emerged from the wagon circle carrying peace banners requesting negotiations. They approached the Roman lines slowly, formally, buying minutes with every step. Roman officers had to decide: allow the envoys through or kill them and violate every rule of civilized warfare. They allowed them through. The envoys delivered Fritigern's message directly to Valens. The Gothic leader offered immediate surrender under specific terms. His people would lay down arms, submit to Roman authority, accept settlement wherever the emperor decreed. In exchange, Rome must guarantee their safety and honor the original refugee agreement. No more slavery, no more starvation, no more systematic abuse. It was a genuine offer. Fritigern knew his infantry couldn't defeat Rome's legions in a pitched battle. But it was also a stalling tactic. Every minute spent negotiating was one more minute for the cavalry to arrive. Valens and his generals debated. Some argued for accepting, crushing the rebellion, without further bloodshed, securing Thrace, declaring victory. Others demanded total war. These barbarians had humiliated Rome for 2 years and deserved annihilation. While they argued, the temperature climbed past 95 degrees. Roman soldiers stood in full armor, shields raised, baking in the sun. And from the north, if anyone had been watching, they might have seen a distant dust cloud growing larger by the minute. Fritigern sent envoys to Valens' position, carrying a white banner. The Gothic leader offered terms if Rome would guarantee his people's safety and honor the original settlement agreement. The Goths would lay down their arms and submit. Hostages would be exchanged. Peace could be restored. It was a genuine offer from a leader who'd seen enough blood and knew his infantry couldn't defeat Rome's legions in open battle without cavalry support. Valens' council debated the offer. Some argued for accepting. The army was exhausted, disorganized, suffering from the heat. Others wanted glory and revenge. While the Romans argued, Fritigern's cavalry was racing toward the battlefield. Every minute of negotiation bought the Goths one more minute of survival. The debate consumed 45 minutes. 45 minutes that determined the fate of the Roman Empire. Sebastianus, Valens' most experienced general, argued forcefully for accepting the terms. His reasoning was coldly tactical. The army had marched 9 miles without proper water supply. Soldiers were dropping from heat exhaustion. Unit cohesion was compromised. Even if they won the assault, casualties would be significant. Why bleed for a victory they could achieve through negotiation? Victor, the Magister Militum, supported Sebastianus. He added a strategic argument. Accepting surrender would pacify Thrace immediately, freeing troops to redeploy against other threats. The Persian frontier was always unstable. Germanic tribes along the Rhine required constant monitoring. Every soldier who died here was one fewer defending the empire elsewhere. But the younger officers wanted blood. 2 years of humiliation, estates burned, Roman prestige damaged across the eastern provinces. The Goths needed to be crushed, not negotiated with. Besides, the numbers favored Rome. 15,000 professional soldiers against 10,000 barbarian infantry trapped in a defensive position. This was exactly the kind of battle Rome was designed to win. Here's what nobody considered. Where was the Gothic cavalry? Intelligence reports mentioned mounted forces under Elathius and Saphrax. Every Gothic army operated with cavalry support. So where were they? The question should have been obvious. It wasn't asked. Valens himself leaned toward assault. This was his victory, his chance to eclipse Gratian's triumph at Argentovaria. A negotiated settlement would be portrayed as weakness, as the aging emperor unable to win decisively. He needed the Goths crushed, scattered, destroyed as a military force. That meant battle. Then Fritigern raised the stakes. He sent a second embassy, this time offering himself as hostage. He would personally enter Roman custody while terms were finalized. It was an extraordinary gesture of good faith from a leader who'd been betrayed at Marcianopolis. Some Roman officers saw it as desperation. Others recognized it as exactly what it was, a stalling tactic. At approximately 1:45 p.m., while the second round of negotiations dragged on, the Roman right-wing commander made a decision that doomed the empire. Bacurius, leading the Roman cavalry on the right flank, either misunderstood orders, acted on personal initiative, or simply lost patience with the endless debate. He launched his cavalry at the Gothic wagon circle. The moment his horsemen charged, the entire Roman line surged forward. Officers couldn't stop it. The assault had begun. And 20 miles to the north, 20,000 Gothic cavalry heard the distant sound of battle and spurred their horses to a gallop. The Roman right-wing commander, a general named Bacurius, made the decision without waiting for Valens's final order. Whether through impatience, misunderstanding, or genuine tactical calculation, he launched his cavalry at the Gothic wagon circle at approximately 2 p.m. The rest of the Roman line, seeing the attack begin, surged forward in a disorganized rush. The careful Roman deployment, the famous checkerboard formation that had conquered the Mediterranean, collapsed into a mob assault. Soldiers who'd marched 9 miles in 100-degree heat, who hadn't eaten or drunk properly, who were exhausted and disorganized, charged uphill at fortified positions. The Goths, fresh and rested behind their barriers, killed them by the hundreds. The curious cavalry hit the wagon circle first. Roughly 2,000 Roman horsemen, heavy cavalry and mail armor carrying lances and spatha swords, charged across 300 yards of open ground. The Goths were ready. Gothic archers positioned behind the wagons had clear fields of fire. They released in coordinated volleys, hundreds of arrows arcing into the charging cavalry. Horses screamed and went down, throwing riders who were trampled by the ranks behind them. Those who reached the wagon barrier found it impossible to breach. Wagons were too heavy to push aside, too high for horses to jump. Cavalry trapped against the barrier became stationary targets for Gothic spearmen. The Roman infantry assault was worse. Legionaries advanced in what should have been coordinated testudo formations, overlocked shields creating mobile fortresses. But exhausted men can't maintain formation discipline. Units that had been standing in the sun for over an hour, carrying 60 pounds of equipment, couldn't execute the complex maneuvers that made Roman infantry unstoppable. The neat checkerboard pattern fragmented into irregular masses of soldiers stumbling forward. The terrain sloped upward toward the Akvarasvars, Gothic position. Not steeply, but enough that exhausted men in armor felt every step. Men started collapsing before they reached combat range. Heat stroke, dehydration, simple exhaustion. They dropped their shields, fell to their knees, gasped for air that felt like fire in their lungs. Here's where it gets genuinely horrific. The Romans who reached the wagon barrier faced Gothic warriors who'd been resting, drinking water, eating, preparing for this exact moment. Gothic spearmen thrust over and through gaps in the wagon wall. Roman soldiers, packed too tightly to maneuver, couldn't defend themselves effectively. The front ranks were impaled. Those behind pushed forward, crushing their own comrades against Gothic weapons. The fighting at the barrier became a grinding meat grinder. Romans would surge forward, die in heaps, fall back leaving corpses piled against the wagons. Officers screamed for units to reform and try again. Men who'd trained for years to maintain discipline under pressure simply couldn't. They were too hot, too tired, too thirsty. Roman soldiers began dying of heat stroke in the middle of combat, collapsing mid-swing, already dead before Gothic weapons touched them. By 2:30 p.m., the assault had been raging for half an hour. Roman casualties were mounting into the hundreds. The Goths held their position easily. Behind the wagon circle, Gothic sentries were watching the northern horizon. They were screaming warnings that couldn't be heard over the battle noise. 20,000 Gothic cavalry had arrived, and they were about to hit the Roman left flank like the hammer of God. The Gothic wagon circle was holding, barely, when the horizon exploded with dust. 20,000 Gothic cavalry, Alathius and Saphrax's entire force, came thundering down from the northern hills at full gallop. They'd force marched back to the battlefield, killing horses to get there in time. Now they hit the Roman left wing like a hammer striking glass. The Roman cavalry, already engaged with the wagon circle and exhausted from the charge, never had a chance. Gothic horsemen, riding small fast step ponies, wielding composite bows and long spears, tore through the Roman mounted forces in minutes. Then they wheeled and slammed into the Roman infantry's exposed left flank. The first sound was thunder. Not metaphorical thunder, the actual sound of 20,000 horses at full gallop hitting hard ground. Roman soldiers on the left wing heard it before they saw it. A rumbling that grew louder, that you felt through your boots before it registered in your ears. Men turned, confused. Officers were screaming questions. Then the dust cloud resolved into individual riders, and everyone understood. Think about the scale for a second. 20,000 cavalry, the largest mounted force any Roman army had faced in a generation. These weren't heavy cataphracts in plate armor moving at a trot. These were light cavalry on steppe ponies, bred for speed and endurance, moving at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour. The Gothic riders had learned their craft fighting on the Eurasian steppes before the Huns drove them west. They could shoot composite bows from horseback at full gallop, hitting targets at 150 yards. The Roman left-wing cavalry numbered perhaps 3,000 horsemen. They were already engaged, already exhausted from the initial charge against the wagon circle. When the Gothic cavalry hit them at 2:45 p.m., the Roman formation disintegrated in minutes. Gothic riders swept through the Roman cavalry like a scythe through wheat. They didn't stop to fight individual duels. They rode through, shooting, stabbing with long spears, killing, and moving on. Roman cavalry tried to form defensive formations. There was no time. Within 10 minutes, the entire Roman left-wing cavalry was destroyed, scattered, or in full retreat. But here's where the Gothic attack revealed genuine tactical sophistication. Instead of pursuing the fleeing Roman cavalry, Elatheus and Saphrax wheeled their forces 90 degrees. 20,000 horsemen executed a coordinated turn that would have been impressive on a parade ground, let alone in combat. They reformed into a massive wedge formation and charged directly into the exposed left flank of the Roman infantry. Roman legionaries trained to fight in formation, shields locked, mutual support. They're designed to fight enemies in front of them. The formations assume your flanks are protected by friendly cavalry or anchored on terrain features. When 20,000 cavalry hit your exposed flank, every tactical advantage evaporates. The Gothic cavalry slammed into Roman infantry units that were already engaged with the wagon circle, already exhausted, already compressed. Gothic spears punched through Roman armor. Horses trampled men who couldn't maneuver in the crush. The impact rippled through the Roman left wing like a shockwave. Units that had been holding formation simply ceased to exist. Entire cohorts, 500-man formations, were destroyed in minutes. The Roman army, which had been struggling against the wagon circle, now faced enemies on two sides. Infantry trapped between the Gothic defensive position in front and cavalry hammering them from the left. Officers tried to refuse the flank, pivot units to face the cavalry threat. Impossible. Units were too compressed, too disorganized, too exhausted. And then the compression began. The systematic murder that would kill 2/3 of Valens' army in the next 4 hours. What happened next was systematic murder on an industrial scale. The Roman infantry, pressed against the Gothic wagon circle in front, hammered by cavalry on the left, began to compress. Units were pushed into each other. Men couldn't raise their arms to use weapons. The famous Roman shield wall, the testudo formation that had broken barbarian armies for centuries, became a death trap. Soldiers suffocated, standing up, crushed by the press of bodies. Others died without ever seeing their killers, cut down by spears thrust over shoulders into the packed mass. The afternoon heat intensified. Men in armor began dying from heat stroke in addition to wounds. Those who fell couldn't get up. They were trampled by their own comrades. By 3 p.m., the Roman infantry formation had compressed from its normal tactical density into something inhuman. Standard Roman infantry spacing allocated roughly 6 square feet per soldier, enough room to swing a gladius, raise a shield, maneuver within formation. In the compression, men occupied less than 2 square feet each. Let that sink in. You're wearing 60 pounds of armor in 100-degree heat, and you have a space roughly 2 feet by 1 foot to exist in. You can't move your arms. You can't turn around. You can't even fall down when you die. The compression created cascading failures across the entire Roman line. Officers couldn't communicate, couldn't orders. You can't shout commands when you're being crushed. Trumpeters couldn't raise their instruments to sound signals. Standard bearers, who normally stood above the formation to provide visual rally points, were pulled down and trampled. The sophisticated Roman command and control system that coordinated thousands of soldiers in complex maneuvers simply stopped functioning. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about how men died in the compression. Suffocation killed as many as weapons. When you're pressed on all sides by armored bodies, your chest can't expand to breathe. Men standing upright, still holding weapons, died from asphyxiation. Their bodies stayed upright in the press, indistinguishable from living soldiers, except their eyes were open and vacant. Some men went mad from the claustrophobia and heat, screaming until their voices gave out, then screaming silently. The Goths recognized what was happening and exploited it with brutal efficiency. Gothic infantry behind the wagon circle used long spears, 12 to 15-foot weapons that could reach over multiple rows of Romans. They thrust blindly into the packed mass. Every thrust hit someone. Didn't matter where you aimed. The Romans were so densely packed that random thrusts guaranteed kills. The Gothic cavalry circling the flanks used a different tactic. They'd ride close, throw javelins into the compressed formation, wheel away before Romans could respond. Each javelin, thrown from horseback into a target you couldn't miss, killed or wounded multiple men. The projectile would punch through one soldier, hit the man behind him, sometimes penetrate a third man before its energy was spent. The temperature continued climbing. By 3:30 p.m., men in the center of the compression were cooking alive inside their armor. Lorica segmentata, the segmented plate armor Romans wore, conducts heat efficiently. In direct sun, that armor could reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. Men literally baked. Some soldiers tried removing their armor mid-battle, fumbling with straps they couldn't reach, dying while partially disarmed. Ammianus Marcellinus recorded that some Roman soldiers, driven mad by thirst and heat, broke ranks and ran toward the Gothic lines with arms raised, begging for water. The Goths killed them, but some Gothic warriors, horrified by what they were witnessing, threw water skins to dying Romans before resuming the slaughter. Even enemies recognized the horror of what the compression had created. By 4 p.m., 2 hours into the battle, the Roman formation hadn't broken yet, but it was dying standing up, crushed by its own cohesion, killed by the discipline that made it legendary. And then, finally, the legions broke. By 4 p.m., the compression had become unbearable. Roman units that had held formation for 2 hours under impossible conditions finally shattered. The Lancers, an elite unit, broke first. Then the Matiarii. Unit after unit collapsed, soldiers throwing down shields and weapons, trying to run, dying in heaps as Gothic cavalry ran them down. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a slaughter. Gothic horsemen killed fleeing Romans for miles, cutting down men who'd thrown away everything to run faster. The battlefield became a carpet of bodies stretching from the wagon circle to the roads leading south. Roman chroniclers later wrote that you could walk for 3 miles stepping only on corpses. The Lancers shouldn't have broken. These were Palatine troops, the Emperor's household cavalry, veterans selected for courage and skill. They'd fought in a dozen campaigns, held positions other units abandoned. But courage has limits, and by 4 p.m., the Lancers had reached theirs. Surrounded, compressed, watching comrades die without being able to help them, They made the calculation every soldier eventually makes. Die here for nothing or run and maybe survive. When the lancers broke, they triggered a cascade. The Matiari, positioned next to the lancers, saw the elite cavalry fleeing and made the same choice. Then the Scutarii. Then auxiliary units who'd been holding positions through pure discipline. Within 15 minutes, entire sections of the Roman line simply ceased to exist as organized formations. Men dropped their shields, 12 pounds of wood and metal that slowed you down. They abandoned spears, helmets, even armor if they could get the straps undone. Running in 60 pounds of equipment was suicide. Running naked might give you a chance. Here's where cavalry becomes the ultimate killer of broken infantry. A man on foot, exhausted from hours of combat and heat, can sprint maybe 100 yards before his body gives out. A horse can maintain 25 miles per hour for miles. The Gothic cavalry pursued fleeing Romans in a systematic hunt. They didn't charge recklessly. They moved at a controlled pace, spearing men from behind, riding past, wheeling for another pass. Professional, methodical, efficient. The killing field expanded rapidly. Men who fled south toward Adrianople were hunted for 3 miles. Gothic cavalry caught them on the roads, in fields, hiding in farmhouses and ditches. Some Romans tried surrendering. Most were killed anyway. Gothic warriors remembering children sold for dog meat, families starved while Roman officials got rich. This wasn't battle anymore. This was payback. Think about the body count. 15,000 Romans entered the battle. Sources vary wildly, but conservative estimates put Roman survivors at around 5,000. That means 10,000 dead or captured in approximately 4 hours of fighting. 2,500 men dying every hour, 40 casualties every minute. The arithmetic of annihilation. The road south became impassable, choked with corpses and discarded equipment. Gothic riders had to slow their horses to navigate the carnage. Later accounts describe streams running red, literally colored by blood. Fields where grain had been growing that morning were trampled into mud, mixed with gore. And somewhere in that hell, Emperor Valens was still alive. His bodyguard, the Scolae Palatinae, had formed a defensive ring around him. They were trying to cut a path south, toward Adrianople, toward safety that was getting farther away with every minute. Somewhere in that hell, Emperor Valens was still alive. His bodyguard, the Scolae Palatinae, formed a protective ring around him as the army disintegrated. These were the best soldiers in the Eastern Empire, household troops who'd sworn to die before their emperor fell. They tried to cut a path south toward Adrianople, toward safety. They almost made it. But the Gothic cavalry was everywhere, and the emperor's purple cloak made him a target every barbarian could see. The bodyguard was cut down, one by one. Valens himself took a wound. Sources differ on whether it was an arrow or a spear. Unable to fight, unable to run, the Emperor of Rome became just another dying man on a field of corpses. The Scolae Palatinae numbered approximately 300 men at the battle's start. Elite heavy cavalry and infantry, selected personally for imperial service, equipped with the finest armor Roman workshops could produce. Their one mission: keep the emperor alive. By 4:30 p.m., when the main Roman line broke, maybe 200 of them remained combat effective. They formed a hollow square around Valens, shields outward, moving south in controlled retreat. For the first half mile, the formation held. Gothic cavalry circled, but didn't commit to a full assault. Attacking a disciplined formation of elite troops was costly, even when you had numerical advantage. The Scolae Palatinae used that hesitation, moving steadily toward Adrianople's walls, visible in the distance. If they could reach the city, Valens would survive. The empire would survive its worst battlefield defeat. History would remember this as a disaster, but not a catastrophe. Then Gothic archers began targeting the emperor specifically. Valens wore imperial purple, dyed with expensive Tyrian dye that couldn't be hidden or disguised. That purple made him visible at 200 yards. Gothic composite bows had effective range of 150 yards. Arrows started falling into the hollow square's center, aimed not at the bodyguard, but at the figure they protected. Here's what makes Valens' wounding genuinely tragic. The first arrow or spear, sources genuinely disagree, hit him in the upper thigh. Not immediately fatal, painful, bleeding, but survivable with proper treatment. The wound slowed him down. The Scolae Palatini had to support his weight, practically carrying him. The formation's pace dropped from a jog to a walk. Gothic cavalry recognized the vulnerability. They charged the formation from multiple angles simultaneously. The Scolae Palatini repelled the first assault, killing dozens of Gothic riders. The second assault cost them 50 men. The third assault broke sections of the shield wall. By 5 p.m., the 300 elite bodyguards had been reduced to fewer than 100 soldiers fighting in scattered groups. Valens, bleeding from his thigh wound, possibly suffering from shock and heat exhaustion, couldn't continue. The bodyguard's senior officer, his name is lost to history, made a desperate decision. They carried the emperor to a fortified farmhouse roughly half a mile from the main battlefield. Stone walls 2 feet thick, a heavy wooden door that could be barricaded. Maybe 40 soldiers remained. They carried Valens inside, barred the entrance, and prepared to hold until relief arrived. Relief was never coming, and the Goths had seen where the emperor went. The most credible account of Valens' death comes from the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who interviewed survivors. The emperor's remaining guards carried him to a fortified farmhouse a half-mile from the main battlefield. The Naistum barricaded the doors and tried to treat his wounds. The Goths surrounded the building, demanding surrender. When the Romans refused, the Goths didn't waste time with a siege. They set the building on fire. Every man inside, including the emperor, burned alive. The Goths didn't know Valens was in the building until later. They'd killed a Roman emperor by accident while burning out a stubborn holdout. His body was never identified. The ruler of half the world became anonymous ash in a peasant's hut. The farmhouse was typical Thracian construction: stone walls, thatched roof, wooden upper floor used for storage. Small windows, barely large enough for ventilation, too narrow for armed men to enter. One entrance with a heavy oak door that could be barred from inside. In peacetime, it housed a farming family and their livestock. On August 9th, 378, it became the deathbed of Rome's Eastern emperor. The Scolae Palatini, who carried Valens inside, numbered maybe 40 men. They barred the door with furniture, blocked the windows with whatever materials they could find. One of them, probably a medic attached to the imperial household, examined Valens' wound. The arrow or spear had penetrated deep into the thigh, possibly nicking the femoral artery. The emperor was losing blood, going into shock. Without proper medical treatment, surgery, cauterization, clean bandages, the wound would kill him even if the Goths left them alone. Here's what makes this genuinely heartbreaking. They were so close to safety. Adrianople's walls were visible from the farmhouse windows, less than a mile away. If the bodyguard had abandoned Valens, some might have reached the city. If they'd surrendered, some might have been ransomed. Instead, they stayed. 40 men choosing certain death over the possibility of escape. The Gothic force that surrounded the farmhouse numbered around 200 warriors. They'd seen Roman soldiers flee inside and assumed it was just another group of survivors trying to hide. Standard battlefield cleanup, root out holdouts, secure the area, collect equipment from the dead. They called for surrender in broken Latin. The Romans refused. The Goths called again, offering terms. The Romans responded with silence. Think about what the Goths were facing. A fortified stone building with one entrance and a handful of armed men inside who'd already proven they'd fight to the death. Assaulting it meant casualties. You'd lose men breaking down the door, more men clearing the interior in close quarters combat. For what? To capture or kill 40 exhausted survivors? The tactical calculation was simple. At approximately 5:30 p.m., the Goths set fire to the thatched roof. The fire spread fast. Thatch soaked in summer heat, dried by months without rain, ignited like tinder. Within minutes, flames engulfed the entire roof structure. The wooden upper floor caught next. Then the interior furnishings. Furniture the bodyguard had used to barricade the entrance. The men inside had three choices: burn alive, rush outside into Gothic spears, or suffocate from smoke inhalation before the flames reached them. Sources suggest some tried breaking out. They died in the doorway, cut down the moment they emerged. The rest burned. When the building finally collapsed, the Goths picked through the ashes looking for salvageable equipment. They found bodies burned beyond recognition, armor melted into flesh. No identification, no way to distinguish emperor from bodyguard. One man among those corpses had ruled half the Roman Empire, and nobody would ever know which one. August 10th dawned over a field that looked like an abattoir. 15,000 Roman soldiers had marched into that valley. Perhaps 5,000 escaped. The rest lay dead, dying, or captured. The Goths, stunned by the scale of their victory, wandered through the corpse field stripping armor and weapons. They'd destroyed 2/3 of Rome's eastern field army in 6 hours. 35 senior officers were dead, including the emperor. Entire units had ceased to exist. The Lancers, the Mattiaci, the Scutari, names that had been spoken with respect for centuries, were now just lists of the dead. And the Goths, who'd crossed the Danube as refugees begging for mercy, now stood as the conquerors of Rome's finest legions. The battlefield stretched across 3 square miles of Thracian farmland. Every square yard contained bodies. Roman corpses in the compression zone were piled 4 and 5 deep. Thousands of men who died standing up, still locked in formation even in death. The wounded who'd survived the night cried for water, for help, for death. Gothic warriors moved through the field with daggers, finishing the Roman wounded. Not from cruelty, from practicality. They couldn't feed or guard thousands of prisoners, and leaving wounded enemies behind invited revenge. The numbers defied comprehension. Conservative modern estimates put Roman dead at 10,000. Some ancient sources claimed 15,000, suggesting almost no one escaped. The truth probably lies between. Roughly 2/3 casualties, the worst single-day loss for a Roman army since Cannae in 216 BC, 594 years earlier. Let that sink in. Rome hadn't suffered a defeat this catastrophic in 6 centuries. Here's what made the loss genuinely crippling. It wasn't just soldiers who died. The Eastern Empire's entire command structure was destroyed. 35 tribunes and senior officers dead, including Sebastianus and Trajan, 2 of Rome's most experienced generals. The institutional knowledge of decades of Eastern frontier warfare, gone. Officers who understood Gothic tactics, who knew the terrain, who'd built relationships with allied tribes, all dead in 6 hours. Specific units ceased to exist as functional military formations. The Lancers, a Palatine cavalry unit that had served since Constantine's reign, lost over 90% of its strength. The Matiarii, elite heavy infantry, was annihilated. The Scutari, the Promoti, the Sagittari, unit after unit reduced to scattered survivors who would eventually be absorbed into other formations. The regimental standards, the eagles and banners that represented centuries of military tradition, were captured by the Goths and paraded as trophies. The Goths themselves couldn't quite believe what they'd accomplished. Fritigern, walking through the carnage on the morning of August 10th, saw the scale of Roman defeat and understood immediately. They'd crossed a threshold. This wasn't a raid, wasn't a successful defensive battle. They'd destroyed Rome's ability to enforce imperial authority in the Balkans. The refugees who'd begged for land and food 2 years earlier now controlled Thrace militarily. But here's where victory became complicated. The Goths had won the battle. They hadn't won the war. They destroyed one Roman army. The empire had others, and now every Roman soldier, every provincial governor, every citizen of the Eastern Empire would be screaming for revenge. The question wasn't whether Rome would strike back. The question was whether the empire that struck back would still be the same Rome that had dominated the Mediterranean for 6 centuries. The answer would determine the fate of Western civilization for the next 1,000 years. Adrianople wasn't just a military defeat. It was proof that Rome could be destroyed. For 300 years, barbarian peoples had believed Roman power was eternal, that the legions were unbeatable, that challenging Rome meant suicide. In 6 hours, the Goths shattered that illusion. Word of the disaster spread across the empire within weeks. In Constantinople, riots broke out. In the western provinces, barbarian tribes who'd been peacefully settled for generations began to wonder. If the Goths could kill an emperor and destroy an army, what was stopping them? The empire would survive Adrianople. It would even recover temporarily. But something fundamental had broken. Rome had learned it could lose. And 32 years later, when Alaric the Visigoth, who'd fought at Adrianople as a young warrior, sacked Rome itself, the impossible became inevitable. News of Valens' death reached Constantinople on August 14th, 4 days after the battle. The messenger who carried the report collapsed from exhaustion after delivering it. Within hours, panic consumed the eastern capital. Citizens stormed government offices demanding information. Had the Goths followed the fleeing army? Were they marching on Constantinople? The city's walls, triple fortifications that had never been breached, suddenly felt inadequate. Merchant ships fled the harbor carrying families and wealth. The price of passage to Egypt or Syria increased tenfold overnight. The Senate met in emergency session and faced a crisis that had no precedent. The emperor was dead. Killed by barbarians, Rome had, permitted to cross the Danube. 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army was destroyed. Thrace, the empire's breadbasket, was in enemy hands, and there was no clear successor. Valens' nephew Gratian was technically senior emperor now, but he ruled from Milan 1,000 miles away. The Eastern Empire faced military catastrophe with a power vacuum at its center. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you about how barbarian perceptions changed. Within months of Adrianople, Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube began testing Roman responses. Small raids, minor incursions, probing for weakness. When Rome's response was delayed or inadequate, the raids intensified. The Alemanni, who'd been peaceful for decades, began preparing for war. The Franks started moving into Gaul. Every tribe that had submitted to Roman authority began calculating whether submission was still necessary. Think about the psychological impact for a moment. For your entire life, Rome has been the power that cannot be defeated. Then you hear that refugees, people fleeing the Huns, desperate and starving, destroyed Rome's best army and killed its emperor. If refugees can do that, what can an organized tribal confederation accomplish? The Gothic victory created a template that would be repeated for the next century. Challenge Rome. If you win, take territory. If you lose, negotiate favorable terms and try again in 5 years. The cost-benefit calculation had shifted. Rome was no longer invincible. It was just another power that could be beaten, negotiated with, or waited out. Rome did recover militarily. Theodosius, the general who replaced Valens, rebuilt the Eastern Army over the next decade. He even settled the Goths peacefully in 382, granting them land in exchange for military service. But the settlement came from weakness, not strength. Rome negotiated because it couldn't dictate. And among those Gothic warriors who settled in Roman territory was a young man named Alaric. He'd fought at Adrianople as a teenager, possibly 15 or 16 years old. He'd seen Rome's legions broken, seen an emperor die, learned that Rome could bleed. 32 years later, in 410 AD, Alaric led a Gothic army through the gates of Rome itself. The city that hadn't fallen to a foreign enemy in 800 years was sacked for 3 days. Adrianople made that possible. The battle didn't destroy Rome. The empire survived another century in the west, over 1,000 years in the east. But it killed something more important than an emperor or an army. It killed the belief that Rome was eternal. One afternoon, 6 hours, 15,000 dead. And Western civilization learned that empires, even Rome, could die.